Picture this. You wake up, open your phone, and a headline hits you like a punch. Texas votes to leave the United States. Not a protest, not a stunt. A statewide vote, certified, final. And before your coffee even cools, your life starts changing. Cut to a breaking news desk. The anchor's voice is steady, but the studio feels tight, almost brittle. You hear the numbers. Turnout was massive. The margin is real. The Texas governor steps up to a podium in Austin and says the line you never thought you'd hear in modern America. Texas is beginning the process of becoming its own country. And then, Washington reacts. You watch Congress scramble, emergency meetings, closed-door negotiations, lawyers digging through old rulings and older history. Cameras catch lawmakers arguing on the Capitol steps because nobody wants to be the person who lost Texas on their watch. But here's the shock. There is no off switch. You and I grew up with a certain map. 50 stars, one flag, one passport, one federal system that feels permanent. Now that illusion cracks on live television. Because even if Texas can vote, the United States can't simply shrug and say, okay. The Constitution doesn't hand you a neat checkout lane. It hands you a maze. Then the next headline drops, and it's worse for your nerves. U.S. Congress fails to agree on a response. Not because they don't care, because every option is dangerous. Crack down, and you pour fuel on outrage. Negotiate, and other states start watching a little too closely. Stall, and uncertainty spreads like fog. You feel it first in ordinary places. Your group chat detonates. People ask, what happens to Social Security checks, VA benefits, federal student loans? Businesses freeze hiring. Some families quietly talk about moving just in case. At airports, travelers wonder whether their IDs will work the same way next year, or whether domestic flights are about to become something else. In Texas, celebration and fear live side by side. Fireworks over downtown Houston. Quiet meetings in suburban kitchens. Pastors, union leaders, sheriffs, and mayors all saying the same thing in different words. We need answers, now. Because from this moment on, the map of America changes forever. Not just on paper, but in your everyday life. And just when you think this is only politics, the camera cuts to the next reality. Federal courts, federal property, and federal power. Because the vote was the easy part. The real fight starts when both sides claim the same ground. The morning after the vote, you and I don't see tanks or movie-style drama. We see paperwork, court filings, and officials weighing every sentence like it could spark a national crisis. Texas leaders say the people have spoken. Federal leaders answer with a hard truth. In the United States, a state can't leave the Union on its own. That isn't just a talking point. It's the core lesson that survived the Civil War era, and it shows up clearly in the Supreme Court's reasoning in Texas versus White, 1869, which treated the Union as permanent unless it's changed through constitutional means. So when Texas claims it can exit by vote, Washington says, not that way. And now you're watching a legal collision between state power and federal power, with your daily life caught in the middle. You feel it first in the courts. Texas files suits to defend its process. The federal government files suits to stop it. Judges issue emergency orders. Appeals move at warp speed. Every hearing turns into national news. And you realize how rare this is. The fight isn't about a new law or a budget. It's about what the country is. Then Congress steps into the storm. Some members demand firm action to protect federal authority. Others push for negotiation to avoid permanent damage. But even if everyone wanted a clean deal, the Constitution doesn't offer a simple exit form. There's no standard pathway for a state to become a separate nation. The closest thing to a lawful route would mean constitutional change, or a formal agreement backed by Congress and the states. That's a mountain to climb in a divided country, and you can feel how quickly the optimism drains when the math sets in. Meanwhile, federal agencies hit questions that used to be unthinkable. Who controls federal buildings in Texas? What happens to federal courts operating inside the state? Who runs border and immigration enforcement? What about federal taxes collected there? Federal workers, military families, and contractors need guidance immediately. And the guidance keeps shifting as the legal fight evolves. Outside the courtroom, there's another gatekeeper: recognition. Texas can declare itself a country, but other nations decide whether they treat it like one. Many governments hesitate, wary of looking like they're taking sides in an internal U.S. conflict. They watch Washington's position. They watch the courts. They watch whether Texas can actually enforce decisions across its territory without spiraling into chaos. Until that question is answered, everything sits in limbo. And limbo is where you feel the pressure most. Companies delay major investments. Banks tighten rules. People start asking practical questions with shaky voices. What happens to passports, citizenship, Social Security checks, VA benefits, federal student loans? And Washington worries about precedent. Because if Texas can do this, what stops someone else from trying next year? By the end of the first week, the mood shifts from celebration to uncertainty. Because the vote isn't the finish line. It's the starting gun. And now the country has to face a question that sounds simple, but isn't. If a state wants to leave, who has the final say? Austin, Washington, or the Constitution itself? The moment you hear Texas might become a separate country, your next thought isn't a flag or a speech, it's money. Your paycheck, your mortgage rate, your job, the price of basics at the store. Because long before any court issues a final ruling, markets do what they always do with uncertainty. They punish it, and you feel that punishment fast. Texas has real economic weight. You and I already know the headlines. Energy, ports, agriculture, a fast-growing tech scene. Texas produces a huge share of U.S. oil and natural gas, and its Gulf Coast is packed with refining and petrochemical infrastructure. So the second Texas even might slip outside the U.S. legal system, even temporarily, companies start asking blunt questions. What rules apply tomorrow? Who issues permits? Who enforces pipeline agreements? Who sets safety and environmental standards? When the answers aren't clear, projects freeze. Hiring slows, prices whip around. Then comes the trade problem, because Texas doesn't just sell to the world. It sells to the rest of the United States every single day. If Texas becomes a separate country, goods crossing that new line could face customs checks, new paperwork, and time-killing delays. Even if leaders promise free trade, the systems still have to be built. You notice it in the real world. Trucks backed up, supply chains rerouted, and businesses suddenly paying for compliance teams they never needed. If you run a small company in Dallas that ships to Oklahoma or Louisiana, you wake up feeling like an exporter. Austin's tech economy gets hit from another angle: talent and capital. Tech companies run on predictable law, stable taxes, and frictionless movement of workers. If employees start wondering about visas, work authorization, or which courts settle disputes, executives hedge. Expansion plans drift to other states. Some companies stay, but only after they secure airtight guarantees. If you work in tech, you feel it as hiring freezes, delayed launches, and wait-and-see budgets. Then the biggest question lands with a thud. What currency does Texas use? If Texas keeps using the US dollar, it can do that informally, but it won't control monetary policy. Interest rates would still be set by the Federal Reserve for the U.S. economy, not Texas's needs. If Texas creates its own currency, that's not just a new design on paper. It's a central bank, reserves, banking rules, anti-counterfeit systems, and, most important, public trust built at speed. During any transition, your savings and your contracts turn into a headache. What happens to a 30-year mortgage written under U.S. law? What happens to wages, pensions, insurance policies? Every contract wants one thing: clarity about the unit of money and the court that enforces it. And then there's debt and assets. Texans pay federal taxes, and the federal government spends heavily in Texas. If separation moves from headline to reality, both sides fight over the balance sheet. Texas leaders might say, "We built this wealth." Washington might say, You benefited from decades of federal spending, protection, and infrastructure. Markets won't wait for a perfect settlement. Bond traders price risk immediately. Borrowing gets more expensive, and that cost trickles down into city budgets, schools, and family finances. You can't ignore ports and borders either. Texas has major ports and a long border with Mexico. If Texas sits outside the U.S., customs rules and immigration processing change overnight. That affects trade, tourism, and labor. Even a small slowdown at a port ripples outward, and eventually shows up in prices you didn't expect to be connected. By the end of the month, the new reality is hard to miss. Texas can have resources, talent, and industry, but independence isn't a shortcut. It's a full rebuild of systems most people never notice. Money, trade, contracts, enforcement, trust. And when those systems wobble, you're the one who pays first. The first thing you notice is that the biggest questions aren't about speeches, they're about control. If Texas is trying to act like a separate country, you and I immediately start asking, who controls the bases, the airspace, the ports, and the crossings? Because those aren't symbols, they're systems. Quiet, daily machinery that keeps life predictable. Texas has major U.S. military installations and federal facilities. In any separation scenario, the United States doesn't simply hand them over. Those sites are federal property, staffed by federal personnel, funded by federal budgets, and wired into national command structures. So you'd likely see intense negotiations, court orders, and temporary operating agreements designed to keep things from spiraling. If you live near a base, you might notice changes in access rules, tighter checkpoints, or suddenly restricted zones. Not because anyone wants chaos, but because everyone is trying to prevent it. Then there's the question people lower their voices to ask: strategic systems. The U.S. keeps its most sensitive capabilities under strict federal control, with specialized security procedures and clear chains of command. If Texas claims independence, Washington's top priority would be making sure those systems remain fully under U.S. authority. That means rapid reviews, tighter protocols, and officials choosing their words with extreme care. You might not see the details on the evening news, but you'd feel the seriousness in the silence between sentences. Now, shift to borders. If Texas becomes a separate country, the line between Texas and the remaining United States turns into an international boundary in practice. Even if the legal status is still being fought over, you and I would see longer waits on I-35 and I-10. Commercial trucks would face new paperwork. Families with relatives in different states would start planning trips like crossings, not casual drives. And if you work in logistics, you'd feel it immediately as fees, delays, reroutes, and missed delivery windows. The Texas-Mexico border changes in a different way. Right now, that boundary runs through federal systems, rules, databases, agreements, and infrastructure tied to national policy. If Texas sits outside that framework, it would have to build its own border agencies, procedures, and technology at speed. Even if leaders promise business as usual, usual depends on networks that take years to build. The transition would hit trade, tourism, and daily commuting in border communities first, because those communities don't get to wait for the paperwork to catch up. And then comes the part that lands at your kitchen table. What happens to your driver's license? Your vehicle registration, your health insurance network, your job benefits, your court system, even small things where you file taxes, which consumer protections apply, which police agency has authority inside a federal building, turn into questions you've never had to ask. If you're a veteran, a federal employee, or someone receiving federal benefits, you'd want one simple answer. Do my benefits continue without interruption? Federal programs are run by federal agencies. Texas can't just absorb them overnight. So you'd see hotlines, temporary guidance, and a lot of pending language. The kind that makes normal people anxious because it sounds like nobody is actually in control. Schools and universities feel it too. Student aid rules, research grants, accreditation relationships. Suddenly, everything has a question mark attached. Businesses rewrite contracts to specify which laws apply and which courts decide disputes. And ordinary people do what ordinary people always do under uncertainty. Stock up a little, delay big purchases, and talk non-stop about what comes next. By the end of this chapter, one truth is hard to miss. Independence isn't just a new flag. It's a rebuild of systems, bases, borders, IDs, taxes, services. And until those systems stabilize, everyday Texans don't feel historic. They feel interrupted.